Okay, let's bow in. And welcome everyone to Buddhist Path of Awakening course. We are on the last chapter now, almost. Last chapter and then the appendix, or whatever it is, of Trungpa Rinpoche's book, Mind at Ease. And we're going to actually, while the whole chapter was assigned for this week, Michael and I decided that it was too long to deal with in 1 week, so he's going to do the first part of it this week, and I'll do the second part of it next week. And after that, if you wish, you can begin to prepare. We're going to switch to a new text. It's called the Bodhicharya Avatara by Shanti Deva. You'll be getting an email about it. It's one of the great texts of Buddhism, Mahayana text. And we'll be using the Padmakara translation. So you'll be getting information about that too. Michael?
Welcome back, everyone. Welcome back to myself as well. I think people know that I was, in the month of July, I was studying at Natartha Institute, which is a meditation and study program sponsored by Trungpa Rinpoche, and spent a lot of time studying Mahayana Dharma there. That's what was presented this summer. And so moving into the way of the Bodhisattva, the Bodhicharya Avatara is right in tune with that. I've developed, once again, great appreciation of the Mahayana teaching. But Mahamudra, which is the point of this text that we've been reading, Mind at Ease, which even in its title says quite a bit about what Mahamudra is about, is Vajrayana teaching. I think in the beginning of the book, he talked about dividing the teachings up into exoteric, esoteric, and forget the third term right off. I should have looked it up. But they all, in the end, point to the same thing, but in different ways. Mahamudra is very, very direct. And at the same time, as direct as it is, it really depends a great deal on literally mind being at ease. So even the title is telling us something. The chapter we're talking about tonight is the 4 yogas of Mahamudra. We'll actually be talking about just the first 2. But before we do that, I wanted to share just a little bit of reflection that I've been doing about this text, which in many ways, even though he uses some fairly modern ideas and terms to communicate to us what Mahamudra is about, is actually quite traditional. If you look at any of the great Mahamudra texts, the Ocean of Definitive Meaning, or Mahamudra, Eliminating the Darkness of Ignorance by the 9th Karmapa, or Moonbeams of Mahamudra by Tashi Namgyal, you'll find there's no inconsistency at all, except perhaps in one point, which is that those texts and most traditional Kagyu texts have much more to say about the importance of devotion than it seems that Trungpa Rinpoche did here. And, it would be nice to ask him if we could, why that is. But I will say just a couple of things about devotion, because it's implicit in what we've read, even if it isn't as explicit as it is in some of these texts. It basically, devotion to the guru, I think, is really easy to misunderstand, and in fact, as a whole talk, at least, as a topic in and of itself. But the essential idea is that the main idea in devotion is developing a sense of confidence or faith in the guru's instructions, in the teacher's instructions. And that this is important because to do the practices, and particularly to stick with the practices, we need to have some confidence that we know where we're going, and that the practices we're doing are going to bring about the result. The others, and so having confidence or faith in the guru's instructions is an important part in supporting our practice. The other reason, or the other way in which devotion is traditionally said to be important in relation to Mahamudra is in the recognition that the fundamental nature of the guru's mind is no different than our minds, the fundamental nature of our mind. Sure, on the surface level and the content level, there's a great deal of difference, but in Mahamudra, we're really trying to understand what is the essence or what is the nature of mind what is the true nature of mind, that understanding that the guru's mind and our mind are in essence in the same in their nature is really important. And we develop this devotion, we develop this sense of confidence or faith by listening to the guru, or in this case, reading what the guru has to say, what the teacher has to say, what Tralog Rinpoche has to say, and reflecting on that, reflecting on what we're told through this text, as well as other things we might have read, and coming to recognize that these things are true to us, that these things make sense to us, and somehow these words open something up in us or let us recognize something in ourselves that we might not have recognized before. Or another way to put it is they resonate with something inside of us. They awaken something inside of us. And even in reading this book, I think people, I know I myself, and I think listening to people in discussion groups, I think people have had that experience where something that Tralog says has really rung true. Maybe not every word, I'm not saying that, but there are places where something really clicks, something really sinks in, something really makes sense, or something really helps us think about, reflect, or resonates with something that maybe we hadn't quite before. And so with devotion, we develop a sense of, one of the words for devotion in Tibetan is mogu. And basically what that says, or what that translates into, is kind of a sense of humble or open interest, that we have some willingness to be open to what we're being told, that there's a receptivity of some kind that we experience based on some instance or instances of clarity, and again, resonance in what the teacher presents to us. I think, devotion's a tricky topic because it tends to get mixed in for people with some things that it's not, like some type of hero worship or blind faith or obedience. And that's not the point at all. The point really is to recognize and develop confidence in ourselves, confidence in the practice through this resonance, through this something that's presented to us, or something that we come to recognize through what we read and what we experience in our own meditation practice. So I just wanted to say that about devotion. And a lot of Mahamudra texts, there's much more said about it. Again, I think it's implicit in this text, but it's in the Kagyu tradition, an important part of Mahamudra practice. So the four yogas of Mahamudra is the chapter 10 that we're talking about tonight. And he begins the chapter by making some statements about path, or the lack of path, that I think might be confusing or a little difficult to follow. So I wanted to say a couple of things before talking about the chapter itself that I think might be helpful in regard to understanding what he says about path, or the lack of a path, in terms of Mahamudra. And to do that, I wanted to go back to one of the previous chapters we read, the chapter on deluded mind, enlightened mind. And just as a reminder, he starts the chapter out by saying that the Buddhist spiritual quest begins with our own mind. If we don't pay attention to our minds, we can't really speak about Buddhist spirituality at all. And he makes the point that we need to utilize the mind we have, which kind of makes sense. And yet, in the context of Mahamudra, one of the obstacles is always looking for or wanting to experience something different than the mind we have, something different than our experience in the moment. And it's in fact the mind we have, the mind in the moment, the mind we have right now. That's what we have to work with in Mahamudra. And then he says that Buddhism teaches that the mind functions on two different levels. Actually, when you really get into it, to all kinds of things about different ideas about mind and kinds of complexities. But to keep it simple enough, the Buddhism teaches that the mind functions on two different levels. At one level is the deluded mind, which in Tibetan is called Nam She, which is, he says, is the cause of all our misery, frustration, and pain. And the other level is the enlightened mind, or Yeshe. Yeshe literally translates as wisdom mind. The other level is the enlightened mind, Yeshe, which is the quality to free us from that suffering and pain. And he says that Buddhism speaks of these two levels as a deluded and undiluted mind. And this is a distinction we need to understand. Along with this, he says the topic of the nature of mind resurfaces regularly in the Mahamudra teachings, and it will tonight in what we're going to be talking about. But it resurfaces regularly in the Mahamudra teachings, which states that there is no real difference ultimately between the diluted and undiluted state of mind. But this must be understood from the ultimate point of view, whereby the diluted mind and the undiluted mind are considered to have the same nature. So that's one of the things we come to realize through Mahamudra practice. But the point here is that we have these two levels of mind, and often the teachings are presented to us from the point of view of diluted mind and from the point of view of enlightened mind. And for this reason, sometimes things can seem contradictory, particularly when it comes to the notion of path, where we say there is no path, but there is a path. The notion of no path comes from the point of view of enlightened mind. And there are a lot of different terms for what the enlightened qualities of mind are. First of all, it's ultimately said to be inexpressible in language. So anything we say is going to be at best a partial or limited truth. But beyond that, there are a lot of different words, and we've encountered them in our reading: basic goodness, bodhicitta, Buddha nature, rigpa, ordinary mind. The basic point being that our fundamental true nature, the fundamental true nature of mind, is clear, aware, awake. It's of the nature of now. It's creative, intelligent, and compassionate. But why don't we experience this all the time? And in the Mahayana, and even more strongly stated in the Vajrayana, the reason that we don't is this enlightened mind, this undiluted mind, is obscured by what's often called in the traditional text adventitious stains. The notion of, or we could call them habitual patterns, we could call them karmic tendencies. And there are a lot of different metaphors for this, that, for instance, it's like the awake, enlightened, ordinary mind, rigpa, whatever we want to call it, is like a jewel covered in mud, or like the sun obscured by clouds. In the Shambhala teachings, we talk about cocoon. And although we usually think of cocoon as something we protect ourselves from the world, it's also true that the cocoon obscures our basic goodness. But all of these things are considered adventitious, meaning that they are not fundamental to who we are. They cover over or obscure, but in no way do they affect the essential nature of mind. The mud that covers the jewel can be cleaned off, and the jewel is completely unaffected by the mud. The clouds that obscure the sky make no difference at all from the point of view of the sun. From the point of view of diluted mind, which is the mind on the ground, the sun seems to disappear, or at least become very hazy and vague. But from the point of view of the sun, from the point of view of enlightened mind, it's always shining, it's always awake, it's not affected by anything that happens around that. So in both the Mahayana and in particular the Vajrayana, the stains, whatever we want to call them, karmic tendencies, habitual patterns, fixations, there are a lot of different words, there's a lot of different ways that we can get at what those stains are, but that they're not integral to who we are. They don't affect our true nature in any way, and that they can be removed, that these are not indelible stains, they can be removed. And with that, there's, as Trungpa Rinpoche has said, there's no notion in Buddhism of original sin or any kind of fundamental flaw. But because our enlightened nature is obscured, we fail to recognize it, and it affects our confidence. We have no confidence or limited confidence in our true nature. We're too distracted and absorbed in illusion or dream to recognize it. Or if we do, we see it through the lens of deluded mind, and so have only a limited or partial experience of it. When we're able to recognize our true nature, there's nothing to be added, nothing to be removed, there's nothing lacking. And that's why self-liberation, which is one of the important ideas that we've come across in this text, is possible, because fundamentally, none of these stains, none of these habitual patterns, none of these karmic tendencies, whatever we want to call them, neuroses and Western, or psychoses even, in Western psychological terms. None of these are considered to be inherent to the true nature of mind. Again, they're stains that cover over or obscure, but they are not inherent in our true nature. And this is why meditation instruction, particularly in the Mahamudra tradition, emphasizes relaxing mind's effort, relaxing mind's struggle, and just learning to rest in what's called, again in traditional texts, uncontrived, unfabricated natural state. That when we look for or try to create experiences in meditation, thinking that somehow we need to manufacture our true nature, we actually, in fact, end up covering it over more. That we're acting on concepts rather than allowing ourselves to simply settle into our experience and just see what's there. So again, as I was told, one of the very first times that I was instructed in this meditation practice, that when we're doing meditation, we're not trying to create any particular state of mind. We're just trying to see what our state of mind is. Or, again, saying the same thing in a different way, when the Karmapa came in 1980 and I was able to participate in the group audience, he began by asking us, what is your meditation practice like? And someone said, I feel when I meditate that I open myself to myself. And the Karmapa said, spoke to his translator in Tibetan, who said, that's exactly right. That's how it should be. And then in English, the Karmapa said, very good. So that's what we're doing in meditation practice, particularly in the Mahamudra tradition. So the notion of path, anyway, is entirely from the point of view of deluded mind. It's entirely from the point of view of removing the stains. It's entirely in what Tralog Rinpoche called the exoteric traditions, the Hinayana or foundational vehicle, and Mahayana, working with remedies to loosen or begin to remove, to clean away, you could say, these stains through practices, such as Tonglen, or even just basic sitting meditation. But there's no path at all from the point of view of enlightened mind. It's the same in the end as it was in the beginning. Our perspective of it changes. From the point of view of deluded mind, it's different. But from the point of view of enlightened mind, from the point of view of the sun above the clouds or the jewel inside the mud, nothing really changes at all. And this is what it means when we talk about, in Mahamudra in particular, although it's true of other Buddhist practices as well, that the ground and fruition, the beginning and end, are exactly the same. The path is, again, entirely from our point of view as ordinary sentient beings, removing the stains, the obscurations, the fixations, the habitual reliance on reference points that obscures our ability to see our true nature. So, to begin chapter 10, I just wanted to make that clear because I think that some of the things he says about path might be a little hard to follow, but hopefully that will help. So he begins by saying we've discussed self-liberation of discursive thoughts and conflicting emotions as the approach of the Mahamudra cycle of teachings. So there's actually quite a bit in that sentence. As a matter of fact, the more times I've read this book, and I appreciate the opportunity to teach because it's, forced me, I guess, to read this book several times, is that you can actually pull quite a bit out of even just single sentences. And this is one. So again, the whole idea of self-liberation is because our mind in its true nature is unobscured, that if we're able to relax our involvement with conceptual mind, if we're able to relax or let go of our involvement with conflicting emotions, then at some point, thoughts and feelings resolve themselves or dissolve themselves. There's all kinds of traditional analogies for this, like if you tie a knot in a snake. Now, why someone would do that, I don't know. But if you tie a knot in a snake and throw it up in the air, the snake spontaneously just lets go. And in the same way, if we don't interfere with our thoughts, with judgments and activity for or against, they tend to dissolve on their own. So that's the self-liberation piece. And the other point is by talking about discursive thoughts and conflicting emotions, he's referencing again what he talked about earlier in the book as the two veils. which are in a quick summary way, a way of talking about these obscurations, these adventitious stains, habitual patterns. Conflicting emotions, I think, is clear enough. He's referring to the kleshas primarily. Discursive thoughts really relate to the kind of cognitive errors we make, particularly our tendency to cling to things as real that are not, beginning most fundamentally with a misperception of duality that we'll talk about a little bit later. And he says, it will come as no surprise then to learn that we do not need to be overly concerned with the concept of a path in Mahamudra, because Mahamudra is the state of reality itself. It can only be conceived of as unchanging and undifferentiated. So again, at this point, we're talking about from the point of view of enlightened mind, that Mahamudra, the nature of mind, is unchanging and undifferentiated. It does not change as we travel the path. What changes is our attachment to our habitual patterns, our stains, our obscurations. But since Mahamudra is unchanging, we cannot ultimately speak about it in relation to time. And although he says, while this is true in the ultimate sense, we still need to understand path Mahamudra from the point of view of our individual experience within the context of conventional truth. So within the context of conventional truth, what he's talking about is, again, our point of view of deluded mind, the mind that thinks in terms of past, present, and future, rather than simply being now. And the mind that gets caught up in fixation and gets caught up in reference points and belief in a self and all the other things that obscure the true nature of our mind. So, as he says, I'll put it in my words a little bit, from the point of view of deluded mind, that's the piece I added in, we go through various edifying stages of spiritual fulfillment and consummation, which again, we could think of as uncovering our basic goodness, uncovering the true nature of mind, our rigpa, our ordinary mind, as well as letting go of, or more importantly, really beginning to see through the obscurations that interfere with our ability to recognize our true nature. And in that sense, he says, each of the four stages or four yogas that we'll be talking about, the four yogas of Mahamudra, should be understood as, each one should be understood as a spontaneous dawning of spiritual fulfillment. So a dawning of spiritual fulfillment is another way of saying that they become revealed. It's not that we're adding to something that wasn't there before or putting something in that wasn't before. And it's not like we're correcting anything in terms of our true nature. It's literally a spontaneous dawning of spiritual fulfillment, or you could say a revealing, an uncovering. We need to reconcile, along with this, he says we need to reconcile the concept of spontaneity in stages here if this is to be intelligible. So again, to make it intelligible, we're looking at the experience of the four yogas, both from the point of view of deluded mind, where there is a path, where there is, again, this working through, letting go, seeing through the adventitious stains, at the same time as we're acknowledging that ground and fruition are the same, that the true nature of mind, Mahamudra, again, all the different words we have for it, when we're able to recognize, identify with, fully allow ourselves to be in, which is exactly the best way to put it, who we truly are, then there is no path because we're just there. So he says the spontaneity alluded to here arises from our own authentic state, the ground Mahamudra or nature of mind, which is pure and uncorrupted from the beginning, and pure and uncorrupted all the way through. Everything is an overlay. Nothing affects our true nature. And he says it's the self-liberation of discursive thoughts and emotional conflicts that allows us to recognize that authentic state within the emotions and thoughts themselves. So we'll be talking about that in a little bit too. And he makes it, again, a really key point to Mahamudra practice. This always takes place in the now, in the present moment, because anything else is going to be conceptual. Anything else is going to be creation of our mind, deluded mind, basically. It's going to be a misperception based on our deluded mind. And that's why when we talk about Mahamudra, Shamatha, and Vipassana, it's really important to understand that when we settle into Mahamudra, Shamatha, we're looking at the mind of now. And when we use the analytic meditation of Mahamudra Vipassana, we're looking at that from the point of view of the mind of you now. We're looking at the mind of now with the mind of now. It's mind basically recognizing itself. Anyway, he says the ground Mahamudra is present in every moment of experience, and realization dawns from that state. So this true nature of mind, Rigpa, bodhicitta, Buddha nature, usually that's talking about it in a more embryonic form. But again, in the Vajrayana, it's fully there, and it's always there. Whether that dawning is a full or partial one depends on the personal traits and spiritual potential of the individual. So whether that dawning is a full or partial one, whether that uncovering or that revealing, whether it really depends on the ability of each one of us at any point in time, again, to be able to let go of, see through, again, those adventitious stains, as the traditional texts say. And he says the 4 yogas are guidelines for the deepening of our meditative experience. They do not represent a kind of structured path we need to fixate on as a linear reality. Or as another text said, we shouldn't think of them as like a ladder we need to climb exactly. But there are the 4 yogas of Mahamudra. The first one is the yoga of one-pointedness. The second one he calls the yoga of non-conceptuality. Although in other texts it's referred to as the yoga of freedom from elaborations, which is actually kind of like that title because it really kind of says what it is. He calls the third one the yoga of one flavor. Again, in other texts it's called the yoga of one taste. And then the final yoga, the yoga of non-meditation. He goes on to remind us, as we read earlier in this text, that there's a difference between meditative experiences and meditative realizations, that experiences are temporary, realizations are permanent. You could think of realization or stabilization of experience. Realizations are permanent, and that they're capable of transforming our conscious experience. So when we actually have the realizations, not the simple experiences, which are the beginning or lead to the realizations, but when we have the realizations, these are real changes from the point of view of the deluded mind point of view. It's a real change in our perceptions of the world and ourselves that we experience when we have these realizations. And as we move through the 4 yogas, meditative experiences become more refined and gradually become converted to meditative realizations. Again, through repeated practice, through familiarization, from doing the practice over and over, so that we become increasingly familiar with the true nature of mind. He says that generally we can't progress from one yoga to the next before attaining the appropriate realization for that stage, but I think, well, let's see. But he also makes the mistake, and this is an important point, that there's a real warning not to fall into the trap of mistaking experiences for realizations. And he quotes Je Gyare as intellectual comprehension arises from analysis and examination. Meditative experiences are the dawning of bliss, clarity, and non-conceptuality, recognizing the mind's abiding nature as realization. So we begin by developing some conceptual understanding of what we're working with. We practice meditation, we contemplate what we've read, we look at our meditative experience. And as we settle in meditation, we begin to have these experiences of bliss, or sometimes just well-being. This might be too strong a word, perhaps. Clarity, or luminosity, or lucidity, and non-conceptuality. Or sometimes he refers to it as mental spaciousness, that there's just generally a relaxation in mind. And we have these experiences in meditation. Again, the important thing is to not cling to them or try to create them, because that becomes an obscuration. You end up, rather than relating to the mind of now, relating to some mind that we hope to create in the future, even if it's in the next moment. So right there, we're no longer in the state of mind of now. But when they happen, when we do have these experiences of bliss, clarity, and non-conceptuality, we're encouraged to rest in them as best we can, without trying to hold on, without trying to perpetuate. Trungpa Rinpoche sometimes used the word disown even, but not in the sense of pushing away, just in the sense of not clinging. And then he then provides just a brief summary, Trungpa Rinpoche does, a brief summary of the experiences and realization in all 4 yogas before going into each yoga in a little bit more detail. So he says with the yoga of one-pointedness, which we'll talk about in more depth in just a minute, that we may have a very tranquil and lucid experience of meditation, but these remain unstable and we don't sustain these for long. It's only when that experience arises naturally, without any contrivance, without effort, without some kind of conceptual sense of a goal that we're trying to achieve or a state of mind that we're trying to create, when it arises naturally, that it can be regarded as meditative realization. We'll come back to that in a little bit more detail in a few minutes, but basically the idea of one-pointedness is we learn to recognize and rest in the nature of mind in a one-pointed way. The yoga of non-conceptuality, or freedom from elaborations, he says here we realize that the nature of mind is unborn and unoriginated. And again, this starts as a brief experience. In other words, that mind, the awake mind, awareness, doesn't come from anything. It doesn't have any particular cause. We may think it does because it's easier to recognize in formal meditation practice. But in fact, awareness arises anywhere, anytime. And we have those experiences. We wake up, suddenly have an experience of awareness in the middle of the day, and we're not even thinking about meditation practice. So it's a misperception or a misunderstanding to think that we create awareness in some way. Anyway, at first, this brief experience, when we're able to directly experience the nature of mind for ourselves, which is what comes out of the yoga of one-pointedness, it becomes meditative realization. The third yoga is the yoga of one flavor, or the yoga of one taste, which he says here refers to comprehending that neither the body nor the mind nor the material world has any enduring essence. So here what he's talking about is the reality of appearance emptiness, that things don't have any kind of permanent inherent self. And if we just think again of our traditional teaching, to say that that something has a self, we'd say that it's singular, that there's one thing there that we're talking about, that it's independent. It doesn't depend on other causes and conditions, because if it did, as soon as conditions change, it's gone. It's different altogether. And that it's permanent, that it's unchanging. And so that's what we come to realize fully in the yoga of one flavor or one taste, is that everything, ourselves and the world around us, is inherently empty. And he says at first this is an experience rather than realization because it retains a subtle duality. But realization at this level arises with the recognition that even though things in this world, we may be able to distinguish individual things in this world, they all have the same fundamental quality of emptiness. That's the one flavor or one taste, that all things are in nature empty of any kind of enduring essence or self. He says it's said that when things of the world are seen as reflections rather than as having some kind of enduring essence, we've attained realization of this yoga, which is actually an interesting statement, and I think I'll come back to that in a little bit. The fourth yoga is the yoga of non-meditation, which is attained, he says, when we can genuinely reflect upon the possibility that the meditation and the meditator are one and the same. This still, in the beginning, has an element of duality because mind is actively engaged in seeing itself that way. But realization is attained when the mind realizes that the meditation and the meditator are non-dual from their own side. From their own side is an interesting term, and it actually comes out of the Madhyamaka teachings, where it's pointed out that a lot of times we attribute a self or a label to things, but that the object, for instance, a book doesn't call itself a book. So from the book side, it's not a book. It's only because we attribute bookness to the book that it becomes a book. So what he's saying here is that that from the point of view of the experience of non-duality, that we just see that as it is without any kind of sense of perceiver or perceived. That's what it would mean from their own side, as opposed to us looking at our experience and saying meditator and meditation are the same. Or another way to put it is, again, mind recognizing itself, awareness recognizing itself. And then he quotes Lama Shang in regard to the importance or the significance of realization. If direct realization has not dawned in the meditator, no matter how fine one's meditative experiences are, it's like chopping down a tree without cutting the root. In other words, if we don't have the full realization, we have experiences which, again, positive in their own right, but they're not a complete realization, then we're still prone to re-experiencing again the kind of discursive thoughts and problem emotions, because we haven't really cut the root of the problem by seeing through, by seeing twofold egolessness, for instance. So what I suggest at this point is that we all take a good posture and take a moment to actually meditate before we start talking about one-pointedness. Good posture, upright, but at the same time relaxed. In the text, he actually gives some ideas for meditation instruction around pages 177 and 179. Essentially, he suggests beginning with the 4 reminders and just contemplating those for a moment. So again, precious human birth, which most importantly is our opportunity to practice right here and now. There's no other time, right now. And that appreciating the significance of this opportunity. Secondly, realizing the reality of impermanence and death, that thinking that we'll have time to practice later is certainly unknown. So again, we should take advantage of this present moment. Some awareness of karma, that what we do has an impact on us. And then finally, just being the unsatisfactoriness of samsara, which basically, again, in this context means realizing that all of the worldly pursuits we might have are ultimately going to not lead to any kind of true or lasting happiness, and in fact, create the ground of suffering. So with that, we can, by contemplating those reminders, encourage ourselves to be fully present in the moment. And then to cultivate a bit of bodhicitta, or enlightened attitude, that we practice not simply for ourselves, but all sentient beings. And so we would recite in Traleg's text, we would recite the 4 limitless ones. May all beings enjoy happiness and the root of happiness. May they be free of suffering and the root of suffering. May they not be separated from the great happiness devoid of suffering. May they dwell in the great equanimity, free from passion, aggression, and prejudice. So take a moment to contemplate that, maintaining a good posture. And then in this context, we'll actually begin by meditating with the support. This could be a visual object, in which case we would just try to stay with the present experience of present perception. But I think most of us are more familiar with working with the breath as an object of meditation. So just settle with the natural breath, with special breathing. Just feel the breathing. Work specifically with the out breath. Or just simply feel the breathing altogether. Just allow ourselves to settle. So again, in the text, he actually talks about 3 ways of resting the mind at this point. Again, we're working with shamatha here. Begin by using the object of meditation to prevent the mind from straying. But we just come back to the object of meditation, the breathing. Whenever we realize we become distracted, we don't try to stop thoughts particularly, but we just maintain the tension of the breath, on the breath. We just come to an unforced, uncontrived resting of the mind. And he gives us an image for this, snow falling gently on rocks and settling easily on the ground. So we bring ourselves back, the breathing, it's that gentle. It's like the snowflakes falling on the ground. The second image for resting relates to resting the mind in a relaxed fashion. So as we continue to just simply settle with our breathing, we let go of any sense of eagerness or goal orientation in our practice. He says this sense of effortlessness is like cutting a cord that binds together a bunch of wheat. Once the cord is cut, the wheat falls effortlessly to the ground. So we just let go, relax in that manner. And then the third is resting the mind in its natural state. He says if we don't interfere with or try to contrive the flow of discursive thoughts, they dissipate by themselves into our natural state of being, the Buddha nature. More than anything else, any kind of struggle to make things different really impedes with our practice at this point. So he says we must cultivate the understanding that meditation is about dealing with our current state of mind right from the beginning. And even if discursive thoughts come up, we simply allow them to fall back into the natural state of the mind. The image here is that of waves dissolving back into the stillness of water. Continue to feel the breath. Allow yourself to slow down. Just simply see whatever's there. Maintaining awareness of the breath. And then we practice tranquility or shamatha without an object. So we let go of focusing on the breath or working with the breath as an anchor and simply look at the mind itself, rest in the mind itself, just as it is. To make this clear, what Trollope says is from the Mahamudra point of view, we shouldn't desire any kind of meditative equipoise, equanimity, nor should we have an aversion to discursive thoughts and conflicting emotions, but view both of these states with equanimity. But the significant point is not whether meditative equipoise is present, but whether we're able to maintain awareness of our mental states. In other words, that we be able to simply rest in awareness, whatever we're experiencing. Rest in the nature of mind, rest in mind itself. whatever might be coming up. Just staying in the mind as it is now, without looking for anything different or expecting anything different. And if we see that we are doing that, just see that as well. There's nothing to stop, nothing to create. And this is further about resting in this state of mind, that we can recognize the clarity of mind. Again, that it's like the sun shining in a cloudless sky. Just experience the clarity of mind. And that we can experience non-fixated quality of mind, that we can just relate to our experience like a small child looking at a temple or shrine room. We have no concept. We'll just be able to see what's there without any labels or any kind of ideas about what things are. It's just being in the present moment of perceptual experience. Continue to let yourself settle into the mind of now. And then just a little bit of vipassana, Mahamudra vipassana. Again, staying in the mind of now. Where do thoughts come from? How does a thought arise? Where do thoughts abide? Where can we locate a thought? Is it something inside or outside? And if so, inside or outside what? Where is the thought? And finally, when thoughts cease, where do they go? How does a thought cease? And then let go altogether. Come back to the breath for a moment. Thank you. So that meditation, contemplation, where do thoughts arise, where do they dwell or abide, and where do they disappear? It's very common in Mahamudra practice. So with that, maybe we can begin to talk about the yoga of one-pointedness. Prahlad Rinpoche says this relates directly to meditative experiences of mental lucidity and tranquility. Basically, what this is talking about is resting in the recognition of mind. One-pointedness is when undistracted mindfulness of the abiding state of mind, the natural state of mind, is one-pointed. Or it's because when there is one-pointed awareness, then stillness and movements are mixed. In other words, we're able to remain in awareness regardless of what we're experiencing in our mind, which is why some of the images used, particularly the image of ocean and waves, and understanding that ocean is like the waves are like the movement in mind, thoughts and feelings, but they're always part of the ocean. It's always come out of and dissolve back into the ocean. And you might think of one-pointedness as primarily a shamatha experience, but it's actually shamatha and vipassana both, because of the importance of recognizing the nature of mind in our experience, recognizing the nature of awareness, recognizing the nature of awake, you could say. So it's actually both shamatha and vipassana. Shamatha as we settle into it, but then it's vipassana that recognizes, and then it's shamatha again that allows us to rest in or sustain the recognition. So it's really a beginning of the union of shamatha and vipassana, although it sounds more like exclusively a shamatha or resting meditation kind of experience, but in fact involves both shamatha and vipassana. Trolloc says it arises with the ability to rest in the state of one-pointed concentration, or we could say that awareness, so that our focus isn't fragmented or jumpy. As a result, we experience a sense of well-being, mental clarity, and an absence of mental agitation. So again, as we're able to settle into the true nature of mind, we experience, again, bliss, clarity, or luminosity, and non-conceptuality or mental spaciousness, or what he calls here an absence of mental agitation. Each of the yogas has what traditional texts would call a lesser, greater, and realized level, so to speak, which is essentially what he talks about, 3 levels within each yoga. So the first one he talks about is sustaining concentration for a short time, that we allow the mind to rest of its own accord. In other words, again, we're not trying to contrive a state of mind. We're not trying to make the mind into anything. We're letting the mind settle into itself, whatever that might be. And that's why it's so important to understand what Mahamudra teachings mean when they talk about settling naturally and without contrivance. So we're not trying to condition it to be tranquil. We're allowing the mind to experience its natural tranquility. And he says there may be obstacles to this, that in the beginning it may be very brief or not even occur at all. But we're advised to keep trying rather than giving in to doubt. Or the other obstacle, so that's one obstacle at this level, is that we can become discouraged by how brief, or we may feel we didn't experience anything at all. But again, we just keep trying. Or the other problem is we may want to remain in a state of tranquility, that some people develop a craving for because it's a pleasant experience, a feeling of bliss, well-being, and lack of mental agitation. So that's not something we want to encourage either, but it's important to remain in a state of, ultimately what we want to do is be able to remain in a state of one-pointedness, even when mental agitation arises. So then the second stage is sustaining concentration, sustaining awareness, you could say, for a longer period. And here he says experiences will occasionally assert themselves even when we're not meditating. In other words, we begin to have these experiences of clarity or well-being or a lack of mental agitation, even when we're not doing formal meditation practice. And when we are formally meditating, experiences of bliss, clarity, and mental spaciousness, he says, become more expressive. They become more vivid to us, able to experience them more clearly. With this, we become more relaxed and we're less inclined to react to things that we experience impulsively or violently or mindlessly. And then the third stage is we spontaneously develop one-pointed concentration. And at this level, meditation and post-meditation experiences, he says, have become fully integrated, and we're able to sustain the experiences we have in meditation throughout the day. Experiences of bliss, clarity, and mental spaciousness, non-conceptuality, become an everyday occurrence, and we begin to see something of their relationship to the nature of reality or emptiness. This is an interesting point. He says this level also signals the realization that all we perceive and conceptualize has no distinct reality independent of mind, which is a point that comes up even more strongly in the next yoga. But with this, he says we begin to experience, when we perfect the yoga of one-pointedness, we're able to rest with some consistency in the nature of mind. Again, begins with very brief experiences. That there's a real change in our perceptions, and we begin to have some aversion for our old ways of behaving. And he says the essence of this yoga is characterized by the non-duality of bliss and emptiness. So again, just a reminder that traditional Mahamudra texts say that formal practice of Mahamudra, that it's recommended short sessions many times, because especially in the beginning, if we try to engage in longer sessions, it's more likely to end up in some kind of goal-directed or endeavor or some kind of conceptualized idea about what we experience. It's brief and to the point. And he quotes Jay Shang, when the one-pointed stage dawns, one realizes the intrinsic nature of one's mind. So again, it's with one-pointedness, we're able to really rest in the nature of mind, the nature of awareness, the nature of our true nature. When the one-pointed stage dawns, one realizes the intrinsic nature of one's mind to be an unceasing stream of clarity and emptiness, devoid of center and circumference, like the expanse of space, settled in serenity and lucidity. So, move on to the yoga of non-conceptuality. And he begins by saying, when we're able to maintain or sustain, whatever word we want to use, the one-pointed state of mental equipoise without craving for it or becoming fixated on it, then we transcend the need to deliberately apply mindfulness. Again, we're looking at the natural state of mind. And accompanying this is the realization that whether our mind is in a state of tranquility or agitation, both are expressions of the nature of mind. And we might begin to see this in the experience, just begin to get the sense of what this means by beginning to understand that we can rest in awareness whether the mind is still or whether we're agitated, that we can still, the space of awareness is greater than agitation or mental turmoil, and that we can actually rest in awareness and let mental agitation unwind itself, self-liberate. We begin to understand that awareness can occur in any situation, or we can recognize awareness, I should say, in any situation. So that's essentially what we're beginning to talk about here. As far as their nature is concerned, we realize that discursive thoughts do not originate, abide, or cease to exist in any way we can pin down. So that was the purpose of looking at thoughts in the way we did in the meditation that we just completed. Looking at where do thoughts come from, where do they dwell or abide, and where do they go? And we begin to realize that the nature of mind is beyond this discursive thoughts, that awareness is there regardless. It doesn't come from any cause, and it doesn't go anywhere. Particular thoughts, and the content of thoughts comes and goes. It seems to come out of nowhere and go nowhere. But awareness itself has no origin and doesn't cease, unborn and unceasing. In other words, he says, the nature of discursive thought is revealed to be the same as the nature of mind itself. And with this, our mind becomes to be free of the limitations caused by or imposed on by our confused and erroneous thinking. This is in particular our tendency to take things as real that aren't real. The nature of mind, which is self-aware and luminous, becomes manifest because we begin as a result of shedding various layers of conceptual confusion, which is another way of talking about what we said in the beginning about removing the adventitious stains. And with this yoga, our meditative experiences are not as fickle or fluctuating. And with that, we become increasingly less confused by appearances and less likely to take things as solid and real. Sometimes people talk about thoughts becoming transparent, that we realize that rather than believing what we project onto things, that we come to see that thoughts really don't have any solid nature. So that's what we're talking about here. And when there are fluctuations, we're not as reactive to them in an extreme emotional manner, feeling joy at positive experiences or despair at negative ones. And he says, because our minds are now freed of erroneous ways of thinking about self and the world, in other words, we're beginning to let go of the idea of a solid self, a true ego, and we begin to see that the world is well, that there isn't a solid or enduring essence in things in the world as well. We're freed of erroneous ways of thinking about self and the world, and we no longer see the world as having any enduring essence, thereby setting up what we ordinarily do as some objective other pitted against the subjective self. So our conceptual categories about self and other begin to dissolve by themselves. Again, we come to realize more and more as we settle into the nature of mind how thoughts and feelings are projections of mind. They're imputations we put on things, fixations about things, and that ultimately, these labels and concepts are empty of any inherent reality. And he says this gives rise to the realization of the Dharmakaya, ultimately. So we're talking about a pretty profound fruitional level here. And again, he quotes Jay Shan. When the yoga of non-conceptuality dawns, the meditator will realize the essential nature of mind. This is an unceasing awareness of pure simplicity. We could think of the simplicity at this point as just simply things as they are, without any overlay. Again, one other way of talking about the yoga of non-conceptuality is freedom from elaborations. So there's no conceptual elaboration attached to things, beginning with the tendency to take things as real that aren't real, imputing realness to things that aren't real. This is an unceasing awareness of simplicity. When such a mind is absorbed in Dharmakaya, which is free from any view of absolute arising or dissolving, acceptance or abandonment, there arises meditative equipoise on the second stage of the yoga of non-conceptuality. So the first stage of this is the realization that ultimate reality and the phenomenal world are co-emergent. This yoga dawns when we realize the ultimate reality of emptiness and the phenomenal world are co-emergent. They're born together. That emptiness and appearance are one and the same thing. As it says in the Heart Sutra, form is emptiness, emptiness is form. And the nature of the world is itself true emptiness. All the world itself is this nature of interdependence and impermanence. So that's the first stage of the yoga of non-conceptuality. And he says at this point we might still be lured by various sense impressions through the power of habit, but we're less likely to give in. We kind of see them on the spot, kind of cut through them. The second realization of this level is the nature of mind as the basis of all experience. So this is kind of similar to what we talked about before, and it's kind of an echo of what we experience in the Mahayana as well. The basic idea of that basically whatever we experience, we can only experience through mind. That our tendency to see ourselves as here and an external world out there is an imputation on our experience. That the perceiver and perceived, or more traditional text, sometimes it's called apprehender and apprehended, I and other, is a mental creation. And that in reality, everything we experience is mind itself. And interestingly, even Western science has some recognition of this. We study perception, for instance, how the eyes work. The basic idea of visual perception, as best people understand it at this point, in simple terms, is that the eyes take in light that's reflected off of objects. This is transmitted into nerve impulses to the optic nerve, and then it's processed in the brain. So it's really entirely an interior process, but that's not at all how we experience it. We project a world out there. Same with sound, where we actually hear sound through the ear and in our head, but we project a sense of a world out there. So that's not exactly the same as what Mahayana mind only means, but the essential idea is whatever we experience is a representation created by mind. This is sort of like what talking about earlier, about coming to recognize that everything we experience in the world is a reflection. The idea there is to think of Rigpa, the ordinary mind, enlightened nature, basic goodness, as sort of being like a mirror, and that what we experience are the reflections in that mirror over and over again. But the mirror itself is not affected at all by anything that's reflected in it. And by contemplating this, that whatever we experience is an experience of mind, we begin to realize that duality is an illusion, that in fact, everything shares this quality of being an experience of mind. And this is why he says the second stage is a more subtle experience, and we still have some clinging to the idea that nothing has enduring essence, that everything is contingent up to this point. But here we come to realize this very mind we experience, in Mahamudra, the terminology is the ordinary mind, is the very basis of all our experiences. And contemplating this actually has some interesting effects. Among other things, it helps bring about some recognition of the essential equality of everything, because again, it's everything is essentially an experience of mind. This will become, I think, more clear with the third yoga, one flavor, one taste. He says at this point that it's only now that discursive thoughts and emotional conflicts are properly seen as lacking any enduring essence. And the way that this happens is we begin to realize that all of the various perceptions of this world that we see as being populated with external objects. And I'm not saying that external objects don't exist. I'm just saying we can only experience them through mind. That we're really we're experiencing what the mind creates, the projections of mind. And that, but when we look at the mind itself, if the objects don't exist, it's hard to say that the mind itself truly exists in any solid, graspable way. So it's, again, a really profound experience of emptiness, that we can't find any enduring essence of mind. And yet, things still appear. And yet there's still relative reality. So again, it's an interesting point we're reaching in terms of our study and practice with these things. In any case, it's only now that discursive thoughts and emotional conflicts are fully and properly seen as lacking any enduring essence. Again, because we come to see, again, this is an aspect of the nature of mind. And with this, we're no longer vulnerable to the effects of our emotions. He says that at this point, there still may be a subtle attachment to the physical world, and we have not yet developed a proper understanding of the relationship between the phenomenal world and emptiness, which really comes more fully in the next yoga, but we're getting there. The last stage of this yoga of non-conceptuality, the yoga of freedom from elaborations, is being with things, seeing things as they are, things as they are. And this happens, he says, when we've gained a genuine understanding of emptiness. And he says to do this, we first realize how perception of the outer world is conditioned by our mind. Again. And then realize that the mind itself is devoid of any enduring essence. That's what we were just talking about. Whatever our experience, our apparent experience of subject here and object out there is a creation of mind. And then we realize the mind itself, we can't really say has any kind of enduring essence either. But the mind, he says, is, in this case, we come to realize the mind is more like space than any kind of entity or thing. It pervades everything, and yet you can't really say that it has any solid substance of its own. And it says at this point, we truly come to see things as they are, devoid of enduring substance. And the phenomenal world and emptiness are recognized as undifferentiable. So again, here we're talking about a true realization of the union of appearance and emptiness. The things appear, and yet at the same time, they don't have any enduring essence. And at this point, we no longer need to think our way through to emptiness. It just becomes a very direct experience. And he says, with this, we find that we can maintain a state of meditation throughout the day without interruption, although maybe not during sleep, he says. But he says it's important to understand the significance of mindfulness and of really maintaining it at this point, because the more we become mindful and aware, the more we notice the last vestiges of these very subtle conflicting emotions and conceptual distortions that we need to purify. And he says that the fundamental difference between the yoga of one-pointedness and the yoga of non-conceptuality is that in the former, the yoga of one-pointedness, we haven't fully understood the implications of the nature of discursive thoughts and conflicting emotions. Whereas with the second yoga, the yoga of non-conceptuality, we not only recognize discursive thoughts and conflicting emotions to be empty of essence, but we also realize that we don't need to eradicate them from our minds, because realizing their true nature is sufficient for liberation to occur, and that the ultimate nature of both is wisdom. So another way of saying what he's saying there is that on this level of the yoga of non-conceptuality, the freedom from elaborations, that we don't need to get rid of them because we see through them. We come to understand that the distortions and things never really had any true reality. There's a very traditional analogy used in the teachings of mistaking a rope for a snake. And the idea is that when we realize that there's not really a snake there, that it's just a rope, we don't need to we won't think about snake anymore. And that it never was a snake to begin with. It was always just a rope. And in the same way, we begin to see through these, cognitive distortions and emotional conflicting emotions, because they're based on the illusion of things being real that aren't real. So in the same way, we're able to see through them. It's another way of talking about transparency of thought. And that's what happens on this yoga of non-conceptuality, freedom from the elaborations. So in particular, I mean, each of these first two yogas are pretty significant in terms of the development of our meditation practice, but especially the second one marks a real turning point, because of the beginning to really recognize emptiness, not as something that we can think about, and we can kind of understand conceptually what emptiness is, but we actually begin to see the emptiness of things. It's a real change in our perception and our understanding of the world. So I'm just about done. The only thing I'd add is that if you think back to all the different things he's talking about realizing in this chapter, it's interesting to think about all of them. Again, we can't conceptually make ourselves see things that way, but we do need to make some effort to understand what it is, where we're going in terms of path. And again, the first step in any of these things is developing some conceptual understanding of where we're going. But ultimately, the real experience comes out of the meditation practice. So we've gone through the first two yogas, and there's a little bit of time for comments, questions, discussion, experiences, anything anyone wants to say. And again, welcome back. Brad?
Grandma.
Hi.
Hi.
Hi. Yes.
Hello.
This is me. This is me in kindergarten.
All right, Oliver, give me a second. All right, so the question I have is on, realizing emptiness.
Yes.
And I was thinking about, Barry's experience, in silent meditation, right?
What is green?
Where, his conceptual chatter is going on, and he just screams out at nowhere, "Shut up!" And what? I guess. That could be like an experience in emptiness or a realization of it. And what leads it to stick or land, or maybe it seems very nebulous. Let's understand it a little more.
Well, I think it is in the beginning because we're quite attached in this lifetime, and if we buy into that aspect of the teachings that talks about reincarnation, lifetimes of taking things to be real that aren't real. And so we can begin by just conceptually thinking about it, but even that kind of has the quality of, well, it was real until I just convinced myself in some way that it wasn't real. But that's one way that we start, and that's sort of like how the Madhyamaka teachings work. But otherwise, I think what it comes down to is just repeated practice, and that's why altogether you can think of the practice as repeated familiarization with what the nature of mind is, and then at some point begin to see at least some thoughts. We begin to realize the emptiness of at least some thoughts, and begin to go from there. There are thoughts that were fairly easy for us to give up on, and other things that we're much more attached to. So again, we just keep working with it in terms of meditation practice. But also contemplation, and that's where study and contemplation, so have understanding of what it means, emptiness means. A lot of times we get stuck because conceptually we go from thinking, well, it's real, to then it must be nothing at all, like a blank space, and that's not exactly what emptiness is. It's more, again, the lack of, he calls it enduring essence, the lack of selfness to it. And so, for instance, in one of the Buddha's sutras, he talks about a roof that has slats that are put together like this to form a roof, and that when it's all put together, it looks like this solid thing that's a roof. But if you take away the slat, the whole thing collapses. It's made up of parts, and that each part leans. Literally, he says that's how how things work. That things literally lean on each other and give this appearance of having a solid self or a definite entity. And from a relative point of view, it does. I mean, there are such things as roofs, but it's actually dependent on all of its parts. There's no one thing in there that you can say is a roof. It's all this coming together of this collection of things, and it's thinking of it in that way that might begins to get at it, and then also again working with it in meditation practice, and just even seeing how in daily life how we have ideas about how things are going to be, and then they're not that way at all. I'm mostly retired, but I always hated Sunday night, or even when I was in school, I hated Sunday night because of dreading Monday morning. But a lot of times it wasn't anywhere near as bad as what my mind made it up to be. And I think we have experiences like that all the time, where we project a reality it's a dream, it's a story, and we work ourselves all up for nothing. The more we're able to settle and just look at our experience in the moment, the less likely we are to do that. In that way, we become increasingly familiar with some idea of emptiness.
Thank you.
Jenny?
Hi, everyone. Jenny, I'm a grateful alcoholic in recovery. I bet you all have met other alcoholics. And I say that because I am so grateful that I had the suffer that was the 12 years before I got sober in March of 2021. And I am realizing, so, that's when my spiritual awakening, I set intention to it, I guess. I quit my job also that day. And so I've been on a journey for the last 2.5 years, and I've grown to really appreciate the journey, not as a means to really anything, but that's the gift we're getting here on this planet as spiritual beings living a human experience. So I really appreciate the concepts, because as a newbie to this, it's just incredibly hard to, it's trying to come to grips with infinity. And when you think of empty, I see a spaciousness. I try to hold everything with compassion at this point. and that's because of the gifts that I received, that I've received so far, and moments of clarity and reflection, being able to be grateful for the really, really painful moments, so that I could have an opportunity to have a peace that I know is never going to go away. And the only concern I have right now is not messing up so that it goes away. But I know logically it can't, because I know it. It's like when I knew I was an alcoholic and I can't drink anymore, can't unsee it. There are just some things that I can't unsee. And so I came here tonight to look for similarities to what I've heard in AA. And then my discoveries as in my Christian, but more universalist. I'm just in a mode of discovery, and I just want to thank you all for being part of that with me tonight and holding space for someone who feels a little uneasy because it's just so uncomfortable at times because the feeling is so new. Thank you.
Thank you. I think maybe that's another point too, is that part of having the experiences of what he talked about as these experiences of bliss or well-being, clarity or lucidity, non-conceptuality or mental spaciousness. I think Trungpa Rinpoche called it a little, he had a different term for it, something like a little bit, not necessarily non-conceptual, but a little bit more mental stability. I can't remember the exact words, but I'll look it up. But that we come to realize that these experiences, those are not adventitious, that those really are something that arise out of the nature of mind. The problem comes when we try to hold on to them or cling to them or recreate them. Because at that point, when we try to recreate, again, we're either looking for a mind that we think might exist in the future, or we're trying to recreate an experience that we had in the past. And by its very nature, then we won't experience the mind of now, which is where ultimately the nature of mind is going to be the clearest to us. Mark?
I totally off the point. There's like an orange moon out tonight. It's really spectacular. So I just had to mention it. If anybody's got a window and is facing a moon, I've never seen anything quite like it.
I'll have to go look for it. We're almost done.
Anyway, that's it.
Not visible out my window. Well, they did have a beautiful sunset for a while.
We got to talk about Drella sometime.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Michael. This is quite a talk.
It's a lot of material. And that's I'm glad that we decided to split it up, because there's still 2 more yogas to go. And again, these are really profound experiences that we might have little glimpses of, or we might have intuitive understanding of, and that's where it starts. But again, just as I suggested that people reread the book over the July break, I don't know if people had a chance to do that or not, but there's a lot in this book, and he phrases it in some cases so very clearly that, again, that's what brings up that sense of devotion and the sense of confidence or faith, that the instructions are valid, that the experiences are valid, and that our experiences are valid. And we can have increasing confidence and trust in those. At the same time as, again, it's really important that we don't try to create something that's not there, but that we allow ourselves to relax, settle. That's why all the things about not contriving, not making, letting go of effort, not being goal oriented, because all of that obscures the nature of mind. That's part of the everyday struggle that we get into. That makes it more difficult to recognize.
Thank you.
Anyway, I guess we need to put up the closing chant. So we'll close as always with a prayer for peace and by dedicating the merit accumulated through our practice and study for the benefit of all sentient beings. By the blessings of enlightened and compassionate ones, by the power of my positive actions of 3 times and my prayers of pure aspiration, may wars, conflicts, epidemics, and all other maladies dissolve in this world, and may the earth and all who live on this earth enjoy the abundance of well-being. May all learn to live lovingly with each other. By this merit, may all obtain omniscience. May it defeat the enemy wrongdoing. From the stormy waves of birth, old age, sickness, and death, from the ocean of samsara, may I free all beings. By the confidence of the golden sun of the great East, may the lotus garden of the Rigdon's wisdom bloom. May the dark ignorance of sentient beings be dispelled. May all beings enjoy profound, brilliant glory. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Michael.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Michael. Good
Seeing
night,
everybody.
everyone.
Nice to be back.
Yes.
Bye.
Thank you, Michael.
Thank you.
Discussion group tomorrow night.
Nice to see everyone.
Yeah, we sure started with the advance, the deep end.
Yeah.
Oh, and there's a class on Thursday.
Oh, yeah.
That's right, the beginning, more beginning material.
So did you get the recording? John, did you record on your end?
Yep.